Hey, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Blind Ambition with Jack Kelly. It's your friend Rick from Blind, and today I'm going to introduce you to Jeff Bogdan, who spent more than 30 years in product development at Microsoft. Jeff, I know you've had such an illustrious career, so I want to give it up to you to walk us through your career.
Well, first of all, Rick and Jack, thanks for having me on. This is I'm excited at the opportunity here. I'll do it succinctly as best I can do for 30 years. Started as an engineer, as a coder, as a programmer, hacker, whatever you wanted to call it. The technical term is software engineer. That's changed a few times over the years, but let's just say software engineer. Did that for what they say IC, individual contributor. So spent the first 5 years doing that. Windows was my product. I interned at Microsoft in 90 working on Windows, came back full time on Windows. Loved it. I mean, Win95 was certainly was one of the early highlights. Windows came to the consumer. We always talked about Brad's mom. Brad was the leader of the team. We always asked the question of, is this good for Brad's mom? Because up till that point, everything we were doing with all this software was mainly for the geeks, for the industry, but not for the home. And the mission statement of a computer on every desk in every home was where we were looking at making it relevant to the consumer. And the idea when we got to Win95 was saying, what is more intuitive to the consumer? Then from there, went into other various products, but that's where I started experimenting with being a manager. And the nice thing about it was the manager allowed me to, I kind of went back and forth. I'll do some individual contributor, I'll do some manager. I'm missing the technical and I'll go back to the engineering. I then finally latched on another 5 years later to saying, no, management is clearly for me. When I discovered some of my reports, that I looked at their technical output and said, oh, you don't want me doing it. You're doing far better than I can do there. And what you need is the soft skills, and where I can help is the people side. So that's where I really went 100% on the management side. And that's where the products that were part of that were Zune and Windows Phone were kind of the two. There were other products that I had worked on, but those two were the bigger and more impactful in terms of what we were doing at the company and things we were exploring, and also in my role about recognizing more of the scope growth I could have as a manager. I've always been more user interface has been my focus. User interface is all the buttons, the menus, the widgets, everything that you're playing with, rather than the behind the scenes deeper code. That's always been my forte. Then at the 30-year mark, I said, I think I've done everything I can do as an engineer, and I want to try something different, which is when I created a role. I defined a role that was learning and development for the team. And that's what I spent the last 3 years of the company doing.
Turn back the clock. It was like, early 90s. It was still new. Was it a work hard, play hard type of thing at Microsoft? What was the vibe there? And
Yeah.
was it different than it is 30 plus years later?
Yeah, I mean, my experience is different now. You said work hard, play hard. That was our mantra at work. And it wasn't I think when you hear work hard, play hard, there's always like the taskmaster, crack the whip. There's that connotation. So you can imagine that as we refined things, maybe we didn't use that term so much. Work-life balance became what we were talking about, but work hard, play hard really was, I know at some point they were telling us what the average age of the employees were. When I started, it was 8,000 employees. And I feel like they said the average employee age was like 28, 26. I'm assuming now the average age is, easily in the 30s. I think I saw a stat that was like 34 for Microsoft. And now we're 200,000 employees. The feeling back then was it was an extension of college. You had a ton of imports. You had a ton of people coming in. I was an import from Virginia. That we were all relocated out here. We had what was called Orphan Thanksgiving, where for the Thanksgivings that we didn't return home, we all got together and it was, you do this dish, you do that dish. And it was, 30 people picking someone else's place to go have our Thanksgivings. In college, you really didn't delineate between what was the school day and what was the play day. Everything kind of meshed together. You were taking an evening class and you were playing Ultimate before that or whatever. And everything was kind of mixed together. I would describe my first probably 5 years. We spent the day at Microsoft on campus or with our campus family. I would wake up and go to work. and I would leave when it was time to go to bed. So there was at one point where my apartment cooked dinner for myself one time in a year in that apartment, because we just were always hanging out together. And it didn't mean that I went to work at 8 and sat at my desk until 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. We would go play volleyball. We would go watch a movie. We had bad movie night for every Monday. When there was a crappy movie, we would all go get some tequila. We'd have some margaritas to warm us up for this bad movie, and then go watch the movie. But then there was the intense part of that too, which was, you're getting in crunch mode. You're getting close to shipping your product. And yeah, then maybe those days it was 8 to 10, you were all sitting at your desk. It really fluctuated. The work hard, play hard didn't balance out every day. There was times when it was an entire month of work hard. There would be for Win95, the last year, we had dinner catered every night, because it was kind of like, hey, we're going to make this simpler for you. Don't worry about figuring out what you're going to eat. Just stay here, eat this, and get back to work.
Now, I'm curious in terms of how work must have evolved, because even when you joined early on, what you're describing seems to be the archetypal, like classic startup feel, which surprises me because at that time Microsoft was already so large and so established. What do you think it was about the company culture that led to that kind of collegial atmosphere that you were describing?
I mean, average age is certainly part of that. The more the more collegial we had, right? I met my wife at work. There were many people there are Microsoft couples, many of them. So then once we started having kids, then it was, okay, well, we can't have that atmosphere. I counter the work hard, play hard. That was great. I think for the time, for those of us that were fresh out of school, I think it fit. Now, there are some people coming in from college, and you'll see groups of people that have kind of glommed together and are behaving that way. And you can see they're living with their work family. The day in, day out, they're doing things with that family. But I think that once you dilute it enough with us with our kids, then that does change the overall dynamic. Like a dinner was a perfect opportunity of you're just sitting around, shooting the breeze with people. And if people have to get home to get their kid to baseball practice, soccer practice, and whatever other activity, then that's going to interrupt that way of bonding. And so you created other ways of doing the team bonding. And what I would tell people is, for everything that was good about work hard, play hard, the downside was there wasn't structure, there wasn't organization to how I approached work. So I am diagnosed ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I never medicate. I tried medication at one point, but I grew up in a family where my dad was military, and so it was always coping skills. Get your stuff together and get yourself organized. The challenge in work hard, play hard, I succeeded, I advanced, I was getting promoted, but it was never predictably, and it was never something where I felt like I was intentionally moving in that direction. It was, well, I'm taking on more projects and I'm getting more done, and therefore I'm getting promoted. And that really came from this work hard, play hard was just, it was okay for me, but I realized later on, once I applied structure, which for me, it was the necessity of, we had kids, and it meant, no, you can't just, there aren't just more hours in the day. You can't just add time to this. When that structure came in for me, that there was a great self-discipline shift for me, where, and maybe you two have experienced this before. I mean, I think it's true for everyone who, when you go from a 10-hour day to an 8-hour day, you don't get less stuff done. You just realize, oh no, in this time, I'm just dialed in. I am now an advocate for the exact opposite. It is, everything is time boxed. It is serially single task, one thing at a time. What's the Parks and Recreation? There's Ron Swanson's line, never half-ass two things, whole ass one thing. And so that is, I mean, I gave classes at Microsoft about that structure.
As you matured in your career, had spent more time at Microsoft, you had to think about how to be more purposeful, how to set up these standards or structures around your work. How did you find those principles, those structures, those frameworks that allowed you to do that? Because I imagine in those early days, it must have been a difficult shift from going from spending most of your day at Microsoft to saying, oh gosh, how do I time box things to 8 hours, 2 hours, or whatever that might be in terms of, getting your work done?
The cool thing about Microsoft early on, what was a big attractor to those of us coming out of college at the time, was we were other jobs. I had interned with a Department of Defense company back east. We subcontracted for IBM. There was always this idea of, punching the clock. It was a regular routine. And Microsoft said from the beginning, we don't care about what hours you work. We care about results you produce. Applying a structure was just me at my own pace deciding to do it. There were plenty of people to learn from. And your whole point of serendipitous is just by being around people, you had other people modeling things and you could riff off of that and stop them and say, this is different for you. Tell me more about it. And so there was a lot of learning that we were doing from each other. There was no external pressure. It was talking to your manager and saying, well, let's talk about promotion track. Let's talk about what's next for you. And as they're highlighting problems, a key theme in all of my connects was Jeff's great until he's not great. Like my output was not regular. Again, let's go back to the ADHD. Let's go back to this kind of loosey-goosey schedule for me that didn't fit well for me. So when they said, well, this is okay, you're compensating for it in a lot of ways with the output that you have, but these higher levels, and talk about manager. A manager is, if you have a bad day, your team has a bad day. There's a predictability that is needed once you get into management. And I think that's a lot of what highlighted for me, like, wow, I can't keep doing what I was doing. And I think that's more of the message to me that said, it's my turn for me to make this change. Everybody, I think, would do it at their own pace, but I would go back and I would say, start artificially, time boxing, start doing it now. Pretend you don't have all these hours, and what do you get done? I think that's probably the only change I would make. Everything else has worked out beautifully, but my predictability, once I did that, it disappeared from my reviews. It was, he is dependable. I show up, I say I'm going to do it, and I can do it. And it's energy management, but getting that dialed in on the time boxing really started amping up the energy, where you get this flywheel spinning and I could just rip through things.
So can you share people who are not familiar with time boxing? Because that seems to be something that really helped you get focused and get your career, to the next level.
The Pomodoro technique. I was doing this well before I ever heard that term. What happens inevitably is you will say, do anything professionally long enough, and you'll eventually say, how much difference can I make in 15 minutes? And you start discounting the time that you have. You just say, like, well, stuff's going to get done, but it doesn't really happen in this immediate. It's just things are going to happen over time, and you kind of slow down on things. Time boxing is flipping that around to say, remind yourself of how productive you can be when all you do for 15 minutes, for 20 minutes, for 30 minutes is one thing. You turn everything else off. You're sitting in a separate space. You don't have distractions. It was a separate space, single space, single use. Pick whatever length of time you're good at, you're comfortable with, set the timer, and have absolutely nothing else going on. The timer is going to rescue you. You're not sitting there while you're working on this project thinking, do I have 5 minutes? Do I have 10 minutes? No, the timer's going to bing. And when the timer bings, you got 5 minutes to wrap up and you got to get out. Freeing to your brain, because you're not going to lose.
Do you stop and just take a break after that, or you go on to the next time box?
Breaks are fine. Most of the time it would be a break, but certainly if you're feeling it, sometimes you're in the zone and you're like, well, you go back to your schedule, you look at what's left, what time you've got, and say, I'm going right back in, I'm rolling. Tony Crabb is a colleague I've worked with from Microsoft. He wrote the book Busy. And in there, he's saying it's not about getting everything done. It is about managing your attention and being intentional about where you focus, I think is great.
In terms of your career progression at Microsoft, working on larger and larger projects, you mentioned increasing your scope. How did that happen? Was it someone tapping you along the shoulder and saying, hey, I think you would be great at this, Jeff? Why don't you come and work on this project? Or was it something where you had to seek out those opportunities in big projects like Zune or Windows Phone?
It's a mix. There's times when you're asked, and there's times when you spot it and go after it yourself. This idea of being a leader, of recognizing when you actually are in more of a leadership role. There's a question that I'll ask new hires: when will you consider yourself being a leader at this company? And if they can't answer that, then start to give them, is it 10 years? Is it 5 years? Is it when you're a manager of managers, like, or just a manager at all? What determines when you're a leader? And the punchline is you're supposed to just recognize that there's always leadership opportunities. There's a term SME, subject matter expert. I'll tell new hires, everyone is a subject matter expert of something. And like recognize what that is. So this gets to differentiation, all that. Recognize what it is, where do you bring value, and where is there an opportunity in the company to add that value uniquely? Recognizing, being aware of what it is that's driving you and looking for those fits in the company or out of the company. In my case, with the portfolio that Microsoft has, yeah, we can move between teams. Zune was one where I moved. I left the platform team to go into what was Media Center at the time, but we were turning it to Zune. But then Windows Phone was, hey, Zune people, you all that did awesome on this user interface experience, we need you coming with the design team over into Phone. What was really special about those two, that's behind the scenes, it's stuff that a customer can't necessarily put their finger on, but there was a fundamental different way. It's what we call design-led engineering, where in the past you had designers. So you have developers, program managers, testers, designers. The designers would show you all these cool ideas and pictures and animations, but then we on the engineering side would say, that's great, but the software, we can't do any of that. And so we were constantly just telling designers, sorry. And there's hilarious. The guy who did design led at Microsoft is Bill Flora. He gave a talk on this progression. He talks about they're making icons is basically all they could do back in the day, to this point where the premise is, what if whatever the designer draws, you engineer the system such that you can make that happen? And it was obviously a mindset change. And given that all of us had always just said, the designer comes in at the end and we tell them no, this pivot, I saw it with Media Center and I said, I want to be part of that. So the main success that I would say out of Zune and Phone was this concept of the designers have lots of really cool ideas. Let them go with it and build a platform that enables that. So if you think of Zune, you think of all these fluid animations, you think of like high typography and kind of this immersive experience. And then on Phone, you had live tiles. Like live tiles is the perfect example of a design-led concept. We had existing technologies that couldn't do it. We built the technology they needed to do it. And to this day, live tiles are gone. The concept of what live tiles gave you was on your start screen, without going into any of the apps, you can actually have a little bit of that app running and it can flip over and show you different things. And you can bring more of the life of the app to your start screen, where the motto of Phone was, get in, get out, get back to your life. We were the people that were saying the goal of our phone is for you to not use it. There's their commercial with showing where people were using their phones at the time. This is 10 years ago. People using their phones in inappropriate places. The dad and kid on a seesaw, and the kid is sitting at the top of the seesaw with the dad at the bottom texting. And they're saying, really? The start screen in those live tiles was an embodiment of that, of saying, if I can just glance, if I can get everything I need without even going into the apps, I can kind of just get a glimpse and then go out. So that's the success. I mean, you can say the downside is we didn't get the apps. It's all about getting the apps. We didn't get the app dev story set up quick enough, and we didn't get the right channel to get people building apps. And so that's, I think, ultimately where Phone lost it.
I appreciate your story there, because I think it's very easy, especially for the folks on Blind, where they write about being disappointed that they're on kind of the unsexy project or the product that gets killed a few years later. And they tend to think that time spent as time wasted.
Mm.
But you're actually saying, well, no, there's a lot of hard skills that you learned. So, experiences add to your collective work in terms of saying, well, actually, I have those business lessons that will inform my work going forward, whether I stay at my role, stay at the company or not. Are there any other tips that you could share for those folks that are disappointed in terms of working on the quote unquote unsexy projects or the weird companies and odd industries?
That's so true. I mean, it's easy for us to discount The main tip is nothing is black and white, nothing is complete, and recognize where the successes are. A phrase I always used at work was celebrate progress, though short of perfection. You have to capture like what was good about this. So what you have now in engineering, in agile development, you have this concept of retrospectives. You do an iteration for a month, then when you're done, you have a retrospective. And just the idea of take time, step back and reflect what went good and what went bad in that last month. I think the more of this agile, I think, gets people to where they don't feel so complete in the failure, but it is a challenge. It's much easier to just say Windows Phone was a failure than saying, well, it's nuanced. There's nuance way more than we talk about these days. Do the retrospective and be objective. I think the earlier that you build this objectivity into what you're doing, that's a muscle that you build. That's a mindfulness, what you're building. Then there'll be a time when you're going to step back and look at that. And the more frequently you do that, the better. When they say, when you point the finger at someone else, there's three fingers pointing at you. The easy way out is it didn't fail because of me. I think there's a lot that is the, what is the differentiation? How do you uniquely add value? Jack, I've read some of your articles about finding your brand that you've written about that I think is spot on. Satya has, probably not going to get it exactly right. He has a quote for the company that he says to the employees, it says, use Microsoft as a platform to realize your dreams or to pursue your passion. It's something like that. But that was a really important pivot on that, where he's saying, you didn't come to Microsoft to be on the Windows team. You have some drive. You have some personal interest, some personal passion, and figure out the second statement. The second statement is figure out something you're doing that aligns with Microsoft's mission and culture and go after it. It can't work that you just say, well, I'm just going to do whatever they told me to do. That's calling out that leader in you and saying, what is your SME? What can you add value here in a way that no one else can? You better be differentiated. And I don't know if that's a challenge for people because they say, I'm not a creative person. Well, if you think that you're creative or not, no, but it's the habit of creating, similar to the habit of observing.
Double clicking on this concept of creativity, you spent a long time at Microsoft and you had the opportunity to create your own role, your own position. Can you walk us through that experience in terms of what it was like to propose that and say, you know what, I want to get into this concept of learning and development, and perhaps that discipline or that function didn't yet exist? How did you make it a reality?
I think that is a very good culmination to look at. So I think you picked on a good one there, because after I had pitched this and after I landed the role and announced to the team, my blog post that followed that was explaining the evolution of pitching that I had done at the company. That started as pitching a feature, and then maybe it got to pitching a product, but then the culmination is you actually pitched a role. Now, I guess I could go beyond that and say I can pitch an entire division, but no, I didn't. Right. I didn't get that far. But that progression of building the muscle is success begets success here. That keep pitching and keep learning. It's both that the company is putting more trust in you. It's also you believing, like we said with creativity is, oh, I can create more. I can keep doing more here. My whole premise is HR, our human resources team, is there for learning and development. The problem is when you're a 200,000 person company, HR, a central corporate function, can satisfy all the learning and development needs for 200,000 people. It's a huge portfolio. And looking at that and going, well, you guys are doing great over there, but we can supplement that. What I had pitched was, let's do learning and development in the orgs that hub and spoke, that there's the hub that is HR, and we're the spokes out in the, and we coordinate. I have to have internalized and completely understand what HR is trying to do, so I'm not cross mission with them. And then say, okay, great, you're doing this, you leave off here, and we're going to fill in from there and add value. My Skip, he's a CVP, a corporate vice president. He has the scope and the money to back it up to say, we want to try this thing. And he was really for it. He actually approached me before I ever wrote the pitch, saying, you're really involved in doing this learning and development as 10% of your time, doing 90% on the engineering. Would you like to flip those? I'm like, well, I was actually thinking flipping it all the way to 100%. But so there was, in terms of the brand that I was saying with Jack earlier, you establish that brand and people come. So it was amazing that when he suggested that, I'm like, oh, I was writing a pitch already. So it was definitely a win-win there. I can't think of a more satisfying feeling at the company than defining a role. It's not just what I'm going to do part of my time. It is, my job at this company is going to be to do it and get that blessed was very cool.
So for folks who aren't quite there, they have that sponsor or mentor that you did in a corporate vice president that had, the influence, the scope, the money, the funding to bring it into fruition. For those who might have to earn a bit more stripes, what advice do you have for them in terms of finding a role or niche for themselves and making it into reality? How do they pursue that?
Good question. I'm going to keep quoting Satya, or I think
Please.
Satya was quoting someone else here, but trust is consistency over time. That is a great statement of, you're going to build trust. The old line we had at Microsoft was there are no shortcuts. There would be people who would come into the company, they would see what other people have done and say, I'm going to do that. And they try to, shortcut of this person is operating as a partner or whatever, and they are trying to shortcut to get to that. Like, you didn't see everything that person did to get to that. There are no shortcuts was trying to remind people of put in the reps, that now I'll switch to James Clear with Atomic Habits and say, what are you doing repeatedly? And the idea of build the muscle around it. The biggest thing is don't expect trust to come overnight, and then realize that, if the equation is trust is consistency over time, how are you demonstrating consistency? So what are you doing intentionally? And going to your brand, your mission, your purpose is, how are you showing up every day on the little things? The little things add to the big things. It might be easy to notice, well, this person went off and created a new role, but to get to that part was, well, we're building training programs that we need for this team, and I'm fostering. I had 80 different people that were making trainings from out of the team. So just showing evidence of this, that there's a track record that you could do it more. So it is the intentionality. The important thing is build a plan, and it's your own plan. And you talked about a sponsor. A friend of mine has a personal advisory board, which I think is. I think we should all have it. And I would encourage, that's another thing to do, is who are the people? Who would you seek out to be the mentors and advisors to make that happen? And this is in our learning and development in Microsoft. There's a form you fill out when you're kind of evaluating, where's my career at and where do I want to go? And they say, what are your ambitions? What are the steps you're going to take? In the next year, what are the steps you're going to take to move forward? But the third one is what stumped me, and it was a good awareness moment for me of like, who are going to be your advocates? Who is going to sponsor you in this? I'm like, I'm not even thinking of where my network can help me here. And it's just a great, you think of LinkedIn now, and I mean, it's so easy to build this very broad network. And so I think the idea of the advisory board can certainly help come up with a plan and then say, who is going to help me get there?
It's interesting. We had another guest, Neil Dar from PwC, a vice chair, saying that was the first time I heard that for the advisory board, right? So it's interesting. So that there must be something to it when you start.
We've heard it twice now. Let's get a third
smart,
one.
accomplished people that this is something you should look for people to look into. This was great about the podcast too. You get to share this advice distilled from various people to kind of turn them on to things.
I truly appreciate that advice, Jeff. And I think it's safe to say that I think a lot of folks that are listening might now consider you part of their personal board of advisors for listening to this episode.
Absolutely.
So thank you for coming on the show, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
That's awesome. Loved it.
That's it for The Blind Ambition. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and a review. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.